Hi everyone! This week, second part of the first unbundling, where we are going to cover the later periods of the first unbundling, so what follows the Industrial Revolution. The usual disclaimer, this course content is partly taken, if not fully, from SFU professor Nicolas Schmidt's notes. However, I am entirely responsible for any error, and I do not legally allow this content to be published without my consent. So, let's summarize what we saw last week. We talked about lower trade costs, in particular transportation costs, that give an easier access to more distant markets. So demand has expanded greatly. Instead of just producing the good for your own country, you can now produce the good for all countries around the world. High quantity needs to be produced to satisfy this demand. Countries will then specialize in the production of goods for which they have a comparative advantage. So, the production of a good for which the opportunity cost is the smallest. Thanks to this expanded demand, firms, regions, countries can exploit economies of scale, whether it's internal, inside a firm, or external, at the level of an industry, to be more competitive. Remember the definition of economies of scale? The average cost decreases as the quantity produced increases. And sales expand further through lower costs coming from economies of scale, and so lower prices. So you can see this kind of virtuous circle where you start realizing, oh, I need to produce more to satisfy all this demand. So you produce more, you can benefit from economies of scale, whether it's just straight decreasing the cost with quantity, or learning by doing, or getting more efficient at producing the good because we're more specialized, which allows you to decrease prices further, which is going to increase demand all over the world. And you get this kind of virtuous cycle. The result is that international trade is booming. One thing we saw, however, is that the production stays in the north, in the G7 countries, because it might be cheap to transport goods, but it's still expensive to move ideas. So it's expensive to move a know-how process, the process of making a certain good in the most efficient way, to another country. It could be the language, it could be many other barriers that are going to keep production in G7 countries, where the Industrial Revolution started. So, I mentioned last week that the first unbundling unfolded in 3 separate acts. We had the pre-World War I, so pretty much from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to World War I, where we found 5 main changes, among which we had urbanization, trade boom, industrialization of the north, deindustrialization of the south, and the result was the Great Divergence. Today we are going to cover the 2 following acts. The Rebundling Act between 1914 and 1945. So you can see that this corresponds to the beginning of World War I and the end of World War II. It's a phase where countries close borders, tariffs increase, protectionism pretty much is back due to warfare times. So production and consumption are now rebundled. Each country is producing for their own citizens only. The third act is more interesting. It's post-World War II unbundling. So after 2 massive world wars that transfigured the landscape in Europe, follows a period of unbundling again, where tariffs decrease, bilateral trade agreements increase. We're gonna go over this concept. So it's pretty much more unbundling. Let's go over the second act, rebundling. Well, this act will be pretty short because if things are bundled, things are bundled. There is not much to describe. World Wars and also the Great Depression in 1929. So international trade is reduced as a consequence. Interwar tariffs are driven by backlash against globalization. So the idea is that now countries are closing again, so they are increasing tariffs. But if one country increases tariffs, then another country has an incentive to increase its tariffs as well as a response. And so countries got into this vicious cycle this time, where the increase in tariffs in one country would just give incentives to other countries to increase tariffs as well. I can see in the chat that there are connection issues. I don't see that. Yeah, Zoom is not reporting anything about the connection. I'm using the campus connection, which is pretty good. I am wired as well. I'm not even using Wi-Fi, so I think unfortunately that might be on your end. Sorry about that. Fascism. Many countries started having fascism, and of course fascism pushes protectionism. Don't let other people from other countries steal our jobs. We should produce for ourselves. You know, the usual extreme right-wing argument. Yes, the increase in those tariffs are between world wars. Beginning of the World War I, then they maybe opened again after World War I, but with the Great Depression, also countries closed again, and you had World War II coming next. So pretty much tariffs increased overall during this period from 1914 to 1945, and of course that reduced international trade a lot. The political landscape was very different as well, with the rise of fascism in many European countries. And remember, European countries were the ones producing the goods and exporting them to the rest of the world. The UK is not willing to support world trade as it used to. Remember that trade was led by the UK with the Pax Britannica and so on. It was a period, starting in 1820, it was a period where the UK was pretty much the leader of the world, but it was not the leader in terms of having more guns, naval ships and so on, but rather a leader in terms of trade, which was relatively new for that time. So it's a period of nationalism and protectionism. You know, some countries allied against others during the World Wars. Fascism grew in the Soviet Union, in Italy. I mean, it was more communism in the Soviet Union. Fascism came in Italy, came in, well, pretty much Germany. Yeah, so every time you have nationalism in general, you have protectionism. So that's usually the argument that extreme right-wing political parties use. They say, we care about our own people, so we are going to produce for our own people, we are going to create jobs in our countries instead of outsourcing or offshoring our jobs, and so on. Because of those wars, so because of those political tensions between countries, there's a need for global institutions. There's a need for something bigger than countries, which are going to make them cooperate. And that will eventually lead to the creation of the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the GATT, the GATT, General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, the European Union as well. All those organizations will have the purpose of federating countries to push peaceful cooperation through trade. It can be through trade or through development policies in the case of IMF and World Bank, or it could be free trade mostly, actually. Let's take a look at tariffs around 1929, so during the Great Depression. Those are tariffs averages, so averages over a bunch of different goods. Yes, Spain as well with Franco, absolutely. Absolutely. Interestingly, Franco did, I would say, one good thing, if I may say that, is that he started a whole campaign of restructuration of towns and cities. So there was a lot of new architectural renovations in many towns and cities in Spain, which makes Spain a great country for skateboarding. That's a side note. But I know that Franco did definitely push for new architectures and new monuments and things like that. And definitely that's something that skateboarders love to play with. Anyway, tariffs are rather high. You can see that for many countries it's above 10%. Some countries it also reaches 40%. The United States are in the middle. And rather low tariffs for Japan, which maybe was still pretty far, was not maybe trading a lot with the rest of Western countries back then. So maybe they did not get too affected by the Great Depression. I'm not sure about that. But you can see in general, there's an increase in tariffs starting after 1928. Stayed high for a rather long time, and if we had a graph for after 1950, which I will show you in a moment, you'll see that there will be a sharp decrease in tariffs in pretty much all the countries. So that's it for the second act, because we can talk about war the whole day, but at the end of the day we talk about the world economy here, not about world diplomacy or world war. Why was there a huge spike in Egypt? I actually don't know. I know, however, that in 1947 Egypt became independent. It was under the domination of UK for a while, so it could be that tariffs in Egypt were dictated by the UK. I'm not sure, but heavily influenced by the UK. That'll be one of my guesses, although they seem higher than the UK. Other than this, unfortunately, I don't know. You guys might have to take a look at it later. Egypt was under NASA's control, yeah. Yes, it is a tall, dark purple jump. So it's just to give you an idea, but of course you don't need to know why each country had such a trend, okay? Just to show that tariffs increased in between world wars. So, the third act of the first unbundling is pretty long. Many things are going to happen over the course of 45 years. And in particular, there is going to be a massive trade liberalization through a bunch of different policies and organizations. And this is what we're going to go through mostly today. First thing, 1947, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This is the ancestor of the World Trade Organization. Literally, the GATT was relabeled the World Trade Organization in 1994. The purpose, well, I'll get into the purpose of the GATT in a couple slides. Many colonies became nations. Oh, cite some examples. I forgot about that. I can cite the French. I can cite the French example. Algeria. There was a war between France and Algeria for a while, and from 54 to 62. Pretty lengthy period of time. Yes, India, absolutely. India became independent. People in my family, of course, did the Algeria War because, at the grandfather stage, many grandfathers in France actually were drafted to go to a war in Algeria. Pretty bad war. France is particularly bad at handling its colonies. They try to keep their colonies in a brutal way, in a non-Pacific way, whereas the UK was able to smooth the transition to independence with those countries by keeping agreements with them. You can think about Commonwealth, for instance. The UK, the Commonwealth, is an organization between pretty much there's Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK. Is there a country or two that I'm forgetting? Those are pretty much countries that used to be under the UK domination, and after they became independent, UK kept very good relationships with this country, in particular for trade and for immigration. If your kid is born in a Commonwealth country, I believe that this kid will be able to travel anywhere in a Commonwealth country during his life, something like that. There is a very good advantage to be born in a Commonwealth country. Singapore, yes. Ceylon became Sri Lanka. There were a bunch of wars, with Vietnam, between the US and the Soviet Union in Vietnam. There were also a lot of advances made in transportation. So the Industrial Revolution is not over yet. In particular, containers. As dumb as it sounds, the system of having those big containers that you can ship with cranes on ships, that you can move onto ships with cranes, was actually a great advance for transportation of goods. Refrigerated ships and trucks that allowed long distance transportation of perishable goods like fruits, fresh fruits, that we can get mangoes from Mexico. Well, doesn't necessarily come in one day, right? Yet our mangoes are pretty fresh when we buy them here. Trucks as well. Air cargo was another mode of transportation. So quickly, a couple of numbers about containers. Yes, I really like bok choy. I eat bok choy literally every day, actually. It's literally in each of my meals. Very good ingredient. But let's go back to containers. In 1965, dock labor could move 1.7 tons per hour onto a cargo ship. 5 years later, it goes to 30 tons an hour. That's quite the improvement in productivity. There were container trips as early as April 1956, and the distance between Newark and Houston is actually pretty long. Containers allow to save time and money. So loading a loose cargo costs $6 per ton, which is pretty cheap. Loading containers costs 16 cents per ton. And so by 2012, you can imagine how the number of containers increased, and there were about 30 million containers. Big ships can carry up to 19,000 containers. So if you live in a city where there's a harbor or a port, go there, go to the docks if you can. Take a look at those massive installations they have and how it can make transportation so easy. It's crazy. In fact, I don't have it here. That's too bad. But let me take a minute to get you a nice link that I'm going to put in the chat. I don't know if I will find it right away. Well, I forgot what the website is, so I won't do it right now. But pretty much there are interactive maps online where you can see real-time cargoes moving in the world. You can see a timeline of how things have increased over time. It's pretty nice. Those real-time maps are very impressive. You can also look at those maps for lights. You can look at which areas in the world right now have lights on and things like that. It's very, very interesting. It tells a lot about urbanization and things like that. Anyway. Yeah, containers are used in all modes of transportation. Ships, trucks, trains. Trains have the same type of containers. They are standardized. The format is standardized so that containers can be moved from a train to a ship and back to a train and even into a truck for final transportation. Yeah, I guess it's also good for pirates. It's true. It's true. Yes, I will definitely upload the link in the lecture notes and put it in the YouTube lecture. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. And because international trade is standardized, it's made way faster and cheaper and more convenient for one country to trade with many other countries. So this way, the French containers don't have to be changed or something once they get to China or the other way around, because maybe China has a different format for their containers. The container is pretty much not moving from the time it's being filled until the time is going to be pretty much unloaded. Along with containers came a huge period of trade liberalization, and in particular, we can identify three waves. The first wave lasts 40 years, from 45 to 85. The second wave, well, goes a bit later, goes after 1990, so it's to say how trade kept liberalizing. And from 2001 to 2018, or pretty much to now, we have wave 3. Wave 1 in particular will be the important one in this lecture. In wave 3, many things happened. Doha launched. Doha is a cycle of, Doha is a city. Forgot where it was. Maybe in India or Pakistan. Oh, Qatar. Yes, thank you. And that launched a whole cycle of trade agreements. Asian regionalism, and, well, the current situation as we know it. Anyway, with the pandemic, trade is still pretty active, especially through online shopping. So what are the main elements about wave 1 and wave 2? After 1945, so pretty much after World War II, multilateralism and regionalism advanced together. So multilateralism is about countries jointly making agreements. So unilateral decision would be you make a decision on your own, and multilateral would be a common agreement. Not for the quiz. For the quiz, you will have to focus on all the lecture notes until the first unbundling. So those lecture notes will be included. Wave 3 will be approached probably in the second unbundling. Yeah. So in June 1947 starts the Marshall Plan. It is a foreign aid plan aimed at helping European countries to rebuild. The main the main recipients, sorry, of this aid will be the UK and France, among other countries. Many other countries will be helped as well, but also that the acceptance of this plan, beneficiaries, thank you. The acceptance of this plan requires European economic integration and, common cooperation. Well, in 1947 is created the Council of European Economic Cooperation. The Marshall Plan was developed by Marshall. Actually, I have his page right now. Where is he? By General George Marshall, the US Secretary of State, back then. Yeah. The next lecture will be about the next quiz will be about the lecture from today and the lecture from last week. So only about the first unbundling. Questions will be related to the first unbundling only. So July 47, the Council of European Economic Cooperation is pretty much the embryo for the European Union as we know it today. It was the first big organization of cooperation between European countries. But only 6 countries back then were part of it. October 1947, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is signed. So many countries are going to agree on a common tariff schedule based on a couple of principles that I will detail in a couple slides. Yes, thank you. Thank you in the chat for answering. November 1947, so quickly after the creation of the Council of European Economic Cooperation, came the first intra-European clearing mechanism. 1951 is a nice one. Many countries signed the GATT back then. We're gonna go through a graph, I believe, with a bunch of members. Yeah, and many countries joined later on. 1951 is the creation of the feeders for the European Union. So if the Council of European Economic Cooperation was the embryo, the European Coal and Steel Community was the fetus. It's mostly European and American, yes. Southern countries and Asian countries will join the GATT a bit later. So this European Coal and Steel Community is the first organization in Europe that oversees tariffs over trade around coal and steel. So it's pretty much the beginning of the European Union, but it only applies to steel and coal. And in this period, you can look at the US tariff average, among others, due to different rounds of the GATT. So when the GATT starts, it's mostly a club of World War II winners. So Western Europe and the US. The US, of course, is leading. After all, many countries in Europe are indebted to the US for helping them, for providing weapons, arms, and also for the Marshall Plan. Germany joins the GATT in 1950, so that would be probably West Germany, because I don't think East Germany was really down for free trade with Western countries. Japan joined a bit later. And this liberalization is mostly about manufacturing goods. We don't really have agriculture and services yet. So you can see that the US tariff average pretty much decreased every time there was either an act or a round of the GATT. So the Geneva round was pretty much the first round of the GATT in Switzerland. And following it, boom, decrease in tariff average. Then the Annecy round. Interestingly, Annecy is a city in France, pretty small, Beautiful though, very touristy, with beautiful lakes by the mountains. And it's pretty much an hour away, I believe, from Geneva by car. It's literally on the other side of the mountains. And then there was a bunch of other rounds, the Torquay round, Geneva, Dillon, Kennedy round. Of course, the decrease in the tariff average was sharp at the beginning, and then as tariffs were already small, they decreased slowly but steadily. You can see here between 60 and 68 that tariffs did not really do much. That's a period of war for the US, in particular the Vietnam Wars. There were 2 Vietnam Wars, and both of them were a failure for the United States. So that could be a reason why tariffs did not change much during that period. And then it kept going down. So let's get into what the general agreement on tariffs and trade is about. It is a multilateral forum aimed at negotiating freer trade, or free trade, and avoid, let me write this down, yes, the use and restrict the use of non-tariff barriers. I will get into what non-tariff barriers are. They are pretty much any kind of measure that a country can use to limit imports, to limit foreign goods coming into their country, which are not just a tax on those goods. The GATT also requires to declare export subsidies. So if you're a country and you want to export, you really want your industry to export abroad, you might want, as a government, you might want to subsidize exports. So you might want to give some money to firms for each unit of the good they sell abroad. That would encourage them to sell abroad, but that would be kind of anti-competitive or anti-free trade if you do this unilaterally and the other country is not doing the same to you. So remember, the GATT is purely about trade. When countries meet in those forums, in those fora, they only talk about trades and business. It's not about diplomatic relationships and wars. I'm not sure what you mean by that's what made the net export column in the GDP.
What I mean was we include net exports in the GDP. So before GATT, after as you said, rules of GATT, people started to tax and all that stuff. So was it because of GATT we have net exports when we calculate GDP, or was it there before as well?
Well, the net exports is just exports minus imports. So if net exports are positive, it means a country exports more than it imports. So those agreements with the GATT, on one hand, could increase your exports, but they could also increase your imports. So the net effect is not necessarily obvious. It really depends on what a country is doing as opposed to the other countries. If one country is imposing tariffs on imports, but no other country is doing it, then probably this country will export more than it will import. But that really depends also on the country, the type of things they export, they import. It's really idiosyncratic. It really depends on which countries you're looking at. The GATT is based on the fundamental principle of non-discrimination, and this relies on a couple of principles, sub-principles. First of all, the most favored nation clause. Every country that belongs to the GATT, or now the WTO, must be treated the same. So if a country benefits from a lower tariff, all members should benefit from it too. You can allow for some exceptions if trade is if that improves trade between countries. So the idea is that you're not allowed as a country to favor one nation above another, over another, if all those nations are part of the GATT or the WTO. National treatment. Once a product has crossed the border, so once a foreign good is now on the domestic territory, it should be treated no less favorably than a domestic product. So it should be as available as any domestic product, and it should not, once it's in, it should not be further taxed, pretty much. Another thing is, once tariffs have been negotiated, they should not be increased. So the idea behind the word binding means that it's an agreement that you cannot cancel easily. So typically, if you have a binding work contract, well, the idea is that if you break the contract, then you won't, of course, have access to your counterpart, because the agreement is binding. As long as you do your job, the contract will compensate you. If you don't, it will not compensate you anymore. That's the idea of binding. Tariffs can be temporarily raised, so it's allowed by the GATT for specific products in particular situations. That can be in reaction to foreign subsidies. So if a foreign country is subsidizing its exports, it will harm your own country, because foreign goods will come at a lower price. So that will compete with your domestic goods. If there's a surge in imports for one reason or another, a country has the right to increase tariffs in order to protect its own domestic industry. And if the GATT judges that this is being inconsistent with the Charter, countries can impose retaliatory tariffs. So they can reply to another country by imposing tariffs of their own. Bush tried to impose a tariff on steel from 2002 to 2004. So that was George W. Bush, the son. And this steel tariff was quickly eliminated when the US lost the case. So the GATT or the WTO pretty much said, you don't have a case here. So you're not allowed to impose a steel tariff. Recently, I can talk about the French case and the US case. Recently, France, was it France or US first? I think it was France first. Maybe changed their tariffs with the US regarding some meat, I believe, regarding beef meat or something like that, to which the US replied with an increase in tariffs on cheese. Trump, though, it's Trump, it's always over the top with him, started with this and then wanted to increase tariffs on a bunch of other things just to kind of punish French industries. I don't remember if France started first or if the US started first with the imposition of the tariffs, but pretty much this eventually got lost, and I believe this is not, there are no such tariffs anymore between those two countries. As soon as a country is part of the GATT, the country agrees to those principles. So if they want to change tariffs for one country versus another, they have to make a case for it, because otherwise it violates the principle of the most favored nation. That's the idea. There also are some dispute resolution mechanisms, so ways to solve those conflicts if there are some conflicts over tariffs or export subsidies. That is been under threat since January 2020. I don't know too much about this, it's rather recent. But the idea is that they have a procedure for cases where countries are in a trade war, pretty much. From 58 to 65, so we are still in the first wave, there is a lot of things happening, in particular in Europe. The European Economic Cooperation comes into force. There's a customs union implemented. So every country being part of the EEC is pretty much subject to the same tariffs, to the same customs union. I remember when I was a kid, so that was not in 68, that was in 90-ish, but I remember going to Spain and being pulled over by the customs on a regular basis to check that we are not buying too much of some products as per the rules established by the European Union. But this triggers a domino effect. The European Free Trade Association, which is like a Scandinavian type of organization, was from the UK as well, in reaction to the EEC. Nowadays, only the non-European Union countries like Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein are part of it. But part of the AFTA was Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and those countries before they joined the European Union. The UK eventually applies to the European Union and joins in 1973. So the UK actually joins pretty late in the game. In 1962, there is a trade act that allows for formula tariffs cuts. I'll get into that in the next slide. It's pretty much a general formula to lower tariffs over time. Another GATT round of negotiations, the Kennedy round from 62 to 67. So I guess after the name of the president from back then. So many things are happening in this period, in particular in Europe, where countries cooperate more and more in terms of trade and create new organizations to cooperate. So let's get into formula tariff cuts. It can be complicated to negotiate each tariff rate for each type of product. So a formula could be negotiated and applied to all tariffs under consideration. A linear tariff cut is a percentage cut that is being negotiated, and the cut is applied to all existing rates. So during one GATT rounds, if there is a linear tariff cut that is negotiated, let's say of 30%, it means that all tariffs are decreased by 30%. Fairly straightforward. Doesn't accommodate for differences across different types of goods, but at least it's fairly easy to implement. So you just have to negotiate on what percentage the cut will be. It could also be a non-linear tariff cut. So in this case, you would negotiate more than one tariff cut. And each tariff cut would depend on how much tariffs already are. If, for instance, you have a tariff which is less than 20% of the value of the good, you could negotiate a 30% cut. But if tariffs are higher than 20%, so tariffs are pretty high, then you can negotiate a higher tariff cut. Here, 50%. So you apply a different tariff cut to different tariffs. But it does not apply to goods in particular, it just applies to numbers. Remember, the idea of the GATT is to reduce tariffs as much as possible to encourage free trade. So it makes sense that here it would like to decrease tariffs more when tariffs are high. Another way is called the Swiss formula. T is the tariff. So the new tariff could be equal to the ratio between a number A times the old tariff over this number A plus the old tariff. Let's plug some numbers to see how it would look like. A would be the only thing being negotiated. So assume that A is, for example, 30%. If the old tariff is 45%, then doing the math gives you a new tariff of 18%. If the old tariff is 20%, the new tariff would go down to 12%. So this is typically a non-linear tariff cut, because you can see that when the old tariff is high, 45%, the new tariff is way lower. So the cut is huge. When the tariff is moderate, 20%, the new tariff of 12 is lower, but not that much lower. It decreased by 8 points. If the tariff is rather low, 10%, the new tariff is only 7.5%. So the decrease now is not that big anymore. So it's a non-linear tariff cut, but it's an automatic formula. And in particular, if the old tariff is 0%, if there was no tariff to start with, then the new tariff stays at 0%. The advantage of this formula is that you only need to negotiate on the number A. The number A is going to tell you by how much the cut is going to happen at each stage for each value of the old tariff. And it cuts higher rates more. No, for the exam, I won't ask you to memorize this formula by heart. No, I don't need you to know that. It's just for your own culture. I might ask you though, what are the 3 types of formula tariff cuts? So you should be able to tell me linear, non-linear, and Swiss formula. Maybe you can just tell me what the principle is. It's a formula where the number has to be negotiated and it cuts higher rates more. That would be enough. But you don't need to know the formula by heart. Don't worry about that. So at each round of the GATT, different tariff cuts are negotiated, but in general it leads to a decrease in tariffs unless there are some exceptions like what I mentioned before. Remember that export subsidies are not forbidden. You just need to declare them to the GATT. So if a country is using an export subsidy, you can retaliate with a tariff on your own to offset the effect of the export subsidy. That would be a case where the GATT is allowing you to increase your tariffs. Now let's go over the notion of regional trade agreements. Oh, what is export subsidy? An export subsidy is the opposite of a tax. So for each unit that a firm is going to export abroad, the government will give that firm some money. This will encourage exports, and this will make exports cheaper to produce for the firm. So the firm will be able to charge lower prices abroad, and so will be able to export more. However, if the price is lower, the country that imports is going to be hurt because imports are now going to be cheaper. So this will hurt the domestic industry. That is enough to make a case for a tariff, an import tariff, that would offset the effect of the export subsidy from your competitor. So all of those trade agreements that I talked about, in particular in Europe, are called regional trade agreements. They are treaties between two or more governments that define the rules of trade for all signatories. So it's a multilateral agreement. There are two types. You can either think about a free trade area, so all the members in an area can just do free trade. Every member keeps its own tariff schedule with respect to non-members, so they do their own thing with other countries. NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, is an example between Canada, US, and I believe Mexico, I think. Yes, thank you. Or it could be a custom union. It could be free trade among members with a common tariff schedule with respect to non-members. So, any member being part of the European Union has to apply the same tariffs with the US, for instance. They also have the same tariff schedule inside the European Union, whether it's free trade or some tariffs are allowed, but they have to be the same across the countries inside. But it's a custom union in the sense that in terms of trade, the US can look at all the European countries as one. Because whenever they export, whether it's to, not UK anymore, but Belgium, France, Spain, Italy, and so on, the tariffs will be exactly the same. I see a question in the chat about VAT. Value-added tax? Well, that is a tax that is just domestic. It's just a tax that the government charges on each product on its territory. So that would be an extra tax on top of a tariff, but I'm not sure what your question is. It's not really about VAT tax here. VATs can do, countries can choose their own VATs. Yeah. One of the reasons French people go to Spain to buy gasoline, tobacco, and booze is because, among other things, VAT tax is cheaper. VAT tax is lower. How will Brexit affect trading between UK and EU? That remains to be determined because the UK government delayed Brexit as much as possible. At least the most recent government tried to delay Brexit as much as possible. I'm pretty sure Brexit still wants to trade with Europe, so I think they're still going to be part of some negotiations. They're still part of WTO, so in principle they still should be able to make trade agreements. One of the reasons Brexit happened is also for other policies. For example, the agricultural policy. It's a policy where every country contributes to a fund, and the fund is redistributed to the agricultural sector throughout the Union. Some countries actually contribute more than others to this common agricultural policy, and some countries benefit more from it than others. And I know that, among other things, the UK was not very happy about this common agricultural policy because I believe it was contributing more than it was receiving. But I'm pretty sure that the UK will still be pretty happy with trade agreements. Immigration, however, is now going to be more of an issue. I don't know if you guys know, but there is an under the ocean tunnel between France and UK. You can pretty much go to UK by bus in, how long does it take? An hour? Maybe an hour and a half? I don't remember. I took it once, but it doesn't take a very long time. It's called the Eurostar. Or you can go by ferry. It takes an hour and a half. So now that Brexit has happened, immigration will definitely be a problem. If you are in France and you want to go to Spain or work in Spain, there is absolutely no problem with that. You show your French ID and you're good. You're good to work. And I know some people who live in France, which are French, and every day cross the border and go work in Spain, and then they come back. In fact, my Spanish teacher is French, but she was doing the opposite. She lived in Spain and would come to my high school every day to teach her Spanish. Now with the UK, that's going to be more of a problem. You might need visa, working visa, study visa, and so on. So probably trade is going to be reduced because the UK won't benefit from all of those nice tariffs. However, I'm pretty sure trade is going to keep going because, well, everybody has an incentive to lower the tariffs and to encourage trade. So I believe that this will still happen. But I think it's more on the immigration side that things are going to be different. Regional agreements are discriminating, free among members and costly to non-members. Anybody inside the agreement, inside the RTA, benefits from lower tariffs and so on. Anybody outside is subject to the usual tariff schedule. Do big countries gain more or lose more from unions? That all depends on the type of country you're looking at. Because you can have some big countries that export a lot, and they benefit a lot from unions. Number one being Germany in European Union. They are the best exporters in the union, and everybody in the union is purchasing their cars pretty much, and other things of course, but everybody knows German cars. France used to be a good exporter, but now is definitely a net importer. So they might gain a lot from the union as well because, they might gain from the union in different ways. But in general, I believe that exporters would gain a lot from unions because they can export for free, because other countries in the agreement won't be able to charge a tariff on their products. But using the adjective big, it really is not enough. It's not precise enough because France is pretty big, Italy is pretty big, Germany is pretty big, but definitely one of the three is benefiting more from the union than the others. What's interesting about an RTA is that it can be costly to members too, if there is what we call trade diversion or no trade creation. Let's start with trade creation first. It is the creation of new flows of international trade between members for goods or services. So, being part of the RTA increases trade or creates new trade opportunities. So far, should be straightforward. New imports can benefit domestic consumers, and new exports benefit domestic firms. So, being in a trade agreement, you can maybe export more easily, so that's good for your domestic firms, and you can also import more easily, which is good for your consumers. That would be trade creation. Both members can gain from trade, and the volume of trade increases. That's the nice part of the story. Trade diversion is the bad side of the story. Trade increases between two members, but at the expense of trade with a non-member. Now that you're part of a RTA, you might have incentives to trade with members inside the RTA, and maybe stop or limit trade with non-members, which are countries you used to trade with. For instance, Canada imported a good from Korea before NAFTA. Now they import this good from Mexico, probably thanks to the nicer tariff schedule and maybe lower transportation costs. And what it can do is sometimes divert trade to a less efficient producer of a good. Korea, for instance, was more efficient than Mexico. Trade diversion may make free trade agreement members worse off. I previously talked about 1958 to 1965 with some GATT rounds and some changes in the organizations of corporations between European countries. 1965, many things happened. Regionalism spreads beyond Europe. The US-Canada Auto Pact happens in 1965. Australia and New Zealand make a free trade agreement. There are a bunch of free trade agreements in Latin America, the first post-war, starting in 1960 and 61. And unilateral preferences to developing nations. So you start charging low tariffs on goods coming from countries designed as developing countries. So it's a differential treatment for developing countries. What is the Auto Pact? In fact, I don't remember what it is. So let's take a look. The pact led to the integration of the Canadian and US auto industries in the shared North American market. While it brought great benefits to Canada, it was eventually found to be contrary to international trade rules and was cancelled in 2001. So that was a common agreement surrounding the car industry. Yeah. So let's look at the number of RTAs signed and the number of GATT members that joined the GATT over time. So remember, the GATT was created in 1947 and the first RTAs started in 1948-49. The number of RTAs since has increased a lot, as has the number of GATT members. The Kennedy round and the Tokyo round are two GATT rounds. Many South-South regional trade agreements are being signed over time, so between developing countries. Because of decolonization, countries who are now independent joined the GATT. So there was an increase in the number of new countries because of those countries who became independent and quickly joined the GATT to benefit from free trade and develop themselves. The two rounds, the Kennedy round and the Tokyo round, implied tariff cuts, as I showed in the previous graphs. But non-tariff barriers rose. So that partly offsets tariff liberalization. And I will get into non-barrier tariffs in the next slide. Non-tariff barriers are barriers to trade other than tariff. That speaks for itself, right? So instead of charging a tax on goods coming from abroad, you can charge a quota. You can limit the number of things coming from abroad. It's a quantitative restriction. For instance, cannot import more than a specific number of units or tons per year. There has been for a long time a quota on textiles, coming from China, I believe. Automobiles in the US and Europe in the 1980s. I think nowadays quotas are not used so much anymore. Anti-dumping. domestic firms can ask governments to investigate whether specific foreign firms dump. So they sell below fair price as a way to compete with domestic firms. So sometimes firms can ask governments to build a case or to investigate whether those firms are actually being anti-competitive by adopting very predatory behaviors. Sell below the fair price. Of course, fair is a very subjective term, but that would be a below cost price. To accept a momentary loss in order to maybe make customers loyal, and eventually you can start making money by increasing your prices. Domestic procurement policies are another example of non-tariff barriers. Purchases by governments restricted to domestic firms. So the government could just say, we're going to buy national, domestic only. That sounds very like a right-wing kind of argument, but well, that's what a non-tariff barrier is. You want to prevent things from abroad from threatening your domestic business. Other non-tariff barriers are subsidies. So this is the other way around. Instead of imposing a price on things coming from abroad, imposing a tax, you propose a subsidy, you give money to domestic firms selling abroad. There are also technical barriers, import licensing procedures, so those are more like legal and administrative barriers that can hinder the trade process. It can be too painful for a firm abroad to export their goods to your country because of some technical barriers. It could be norms on the way goods should be made. For instance, fruits or like any type of food has to respect some sanitary norms, for instance. Or more generally, some equipments have to abide by a certain number of safety norms to be able to be exported in a certain area. Countervailing measures are used to offset the effect of a country subsidizing a good it exports. So you can hear the word counter in countervailing. The idea is to respond to a foreign country subsidizing its exports by imposing a tariff exactly equal to the rate at which that good is subsidized. The idea is to exactly offset the subsidy coming from abroad. If a foreign country is giving 5 cents for each unit to a firm, 5 cents for each unit it sells abroad, then the domestic country could impose a tariff of 5 cents on each unit it buys from that country. That should rebalance things. Another big year, 1973. We had two European organizations, two separate ones. We had the EEC 6. So we had Italy, France, West Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy. Did I forget anyone? Spain? No, not Spain. Yeah, pretty much 6. Luxembourg, thank you very much. Yes, that's what the L is, yes. And more on the east and more on the, northeast, there was the EFTA 7 with the UK, Czech Republic, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and so on. Eventually in 1973, when the UK joined the European Union, there was a common integration of all of those countries, and it became more like a uniform bloc, a free trade bloc, than it was before. Of course, in 1973, so UK, Denmark, Ireland, yes, Finland and Sweden had not joined yet. I believe they joined in 1995. But you can see that now those sets are part of those organizations. One of them is a subset of the other, as opposed to two non-overlapping sets. The question about the euro. That's another ball game. So the idea behind the euro was to create a currency that is strong enough to rival the dollar and maybe become the international currency. Well, clearly the international currency objective has not been filled. The dollar is still number one. Some countries did not want to adopt the euro because they would lose independence on their currency. The European Central Bank is independent. So when it decides to print money, to increase money supply, it does so independently of what countries want. The problem is, maybe France wants to increase money supply because of COVID. They want to provide vaccines, which they're not really doing right now. Not much, unfortunately. Whereas maybe another country might want money supply to be limited. And so the idea is that all of those countries have lost their power to print money. Pretty much. Some countries did not want to lose this tool, because remember, a government doesn't have many tools to conduct economic policy. It has its own budget, public spending that happens through taxation. So the government taxes and uses this money to fund infrastructure, public goods, and so on. And there is also the money machine. If the government wants to create a new hospital in Vancouver, it could either use the tax revenue from BC citizens, or it could just print some money and use this to build a hospital. Those are two different ways to conduct economic policy that countries in the euro don't have anymore. They only have their own budget, their own government spending as a tool. But they cannot use the currency to conduct such operations anymore. The idea was to have a strong currency to favor imports in particular, because I believe that most countries in the European Union are net importers. Like as a whole, the European Union is a net importer. So the idea was, with a strong currency, imports are more convenient, nicer. The idea was also to federate the Union. The idea was that those countries went through 2 world wars in the space of 30 years. And those wars were massive. They did a lot of damage to populations, in particular France and Germany, because France and Germany were in the middle of those world wars, literally. This is where wars would happen, and Belgium, who got ravaged. So the idea was to also federate all of those countries under the same currency to foster peace and cooperation. Well, the euro is strong, yes, but it doesn't come without caveats. So I don't know if a strong euro is really what the European Union wants right now, but this is what I've chosen. In 1973, also started the Tokyo round. It is the first round to tackle beyond tariff issues. So subsidies, countervailing measures, technical barriers, all those things are approached during that round, whereas they were not before. All the GATT rounds before were about lowering tariffs. This time, it was also about fighting against all of the non-tariff barriers. Regionalism advances in Africa and Asia, so more regional trade agreements were signed in those continents as well. The Caribbean Community and Common Market, the CARICOM, in 1973. The Economic Community of West African States in 1975. the Economic Community of the Great Lakes Country in 1976. There's a bunch. You don't need to know them by heart at all, because I barely know them. It's just a way to show you how much liberalization, how much trade liberalized during that period. Oil shocks and stagflation made liberalization difficult. So stagflation is not the same as inflation. Inflation corresponds to the increase in prices. Stagflation corresponds to the increase in unemployment while inflation doesn't move, I believe. Let me check that quickly. It's been a long time since I saw stagflation. Yeah, so unemployment stays high, however inflation is high and growth is pretty small, it's pretty slow. So usually with growth comes inflation. Those are phenomena that usually work hand in hand. However, stagflation is a phenomenon where growth is rather slow, yet inflation is pretty high. And that was due to, in particular, the oil shocks that increased the costs of extracting oil and treating the oil and refining it, which induced stagflation. Let's talk about the second wave between 1983 and 2000. In 1986, Spain and Portugal are now part of the European Union. Canada and US launched a free trade agreement to deepen and widen the Auto Pact mentioned before. Well, in 2001, this free trade agreement ended anyway. Oops, sorry, it might have been the wrong date. Let me correct that later. But between 86 and 1990, it's mostly North-North regional trade agreement. So pretty much between North America and Western Europe. In 1990 is when North-South regionalism is launched. And 1990, incidentally, is when the second unbundling starts, which I will talk about next week. In 1990, US-Mexico became NAFTA. Mercosur is a free trade agreement between South American countries in 1991. I am as old as the Mercosur. That's good to know. In 1989, there was the fall of Berlin's Wall, which triggers pretty much the end of Cold War. So many RTAs are going to be signed between the European Union, so Western Europe, and Eastern European countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union is going to give rise to many countries: Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Ukraine, all of those countries, which are all the more RTAs to sign. You don't need to remember dates too much. No, you don't need to remember too much. You will need to remember dates for the unbundlings, yes, but not for those big waves in a year. Don't worry too much about that. But you need to know the main dates for the unbundlings, that's for sure. Yeah. And the GATT depends to the WTO in 1994, or rather 1995, when it starts to be in effect. So I want to draw your attention to, again, the 1990-2001 era, where North-South regionalism starts. And this is due in particular to the second unbundling which is the lower costs of moving ideas. Look at this mess, this spaghetti ball of African regional trade agreements. This one you need to know by heart. No, I'm kidding. There's no way. You can just see how much trade liberalized. So there's a bunch I had never heard of and I will never remember. Those acronyms are way too complicated for me. I might know some of them in French, so it's a pain. And a lot of them overlap with each other. For example, Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea had their own, the Mano River Union, but each country was also involved in the bigger ECOWAS, whereas Guinea was also part of the CLIS. This is just at some point it just becomes a joke with all of those acronyms. Conseil de l'Antenne, that would be the French one, yeah. Benin, Togo, Côte d'Ivoire, they speak French there. Niger as well, Burkina Faso as well, yeah. A mess. Let's move on. Let me talk about the effect of a tariff on a domestic country. I know that at this stage, your knowledge of economic theory is not that big, so you might have troubles understanding this graph. Bear with me for a bit. I just want to give you the intuition. You will see this kind of graph at a 300 level course if you take international trade courses. So don't worry if you don't understand everything. But I want to show you the effect of a tariff on a domestic country, at least. So imagine that you have a country with a supply, PS of Q, the red curve, and the blue curve is the demand function, PD of Q. If those countries are closed, oh, in ECON 103, yes, okay, so some of you might already know about it. If the country remains in autarky, autarky means closed, no trade with the rest of the world, the price and the quantity at equilibrium will be where supply meets demand, which is P star. This is the pricing effect if this country is not trading with anybody else. Now, if this country instead opens up and ends up importing that good in particular, if the country imports that good, it means that the quantity demanded by consumers is higher than the quantity demanded by the quantity supplied by domestic producers. So if this country is a net importer of that good, then it means that the new price, the world price, PW, is lower than the domestic price. The price that would be in effect if they were in a closed economy. And you can see that at this price, PW, you can align this with the supply here and the demand here. You can see QH will be the home quantity because this is the quantity that producers are willing to sell at this price. However, consumers are willing to purchase a way higher quantity at this price. So the difference between what consumers want to purchase and what the firms, the domestic firms, are willing to produce will be equal to the imports. And hence this quantity will be called QH plus F. H for home, F for foreign. Make sense so far? So I am just so far picturing a country which is an importer. Because it imports, it means that the quantity demanded by consumers is higher than what the domestic producers are willing to supply. So the world price for that good is lower than the closed economy price. Okay. Now imagine that this country imposes a tariff on foreign goods. So The tariff will increase prices overall by an amount of T. P, W is the world price. But now, every time they want to purchase a good, that good, they will have to pay PW plus T. I changed notation in the lecture notes, so I'm going to re-upload the lecture notes. I'm going to upload those lecture notes afterwards. Sorry about that. The 1 plus TPW is just a bit harder to deal with. It just makes things more complicated. So I just here talked about an easy tariff, which is a dollar amount. The case where it's 1 plus T would be a percentage amount, and the intuition is the same. It would be more confusing to explain. So I will re-upload the lecture notes after the lecture. Sorry about that. So I also noticed a couple of typos already right now. So every time after the lecture, I make the adjustments and I re-upload the lecture notes. So I really advise you to look at the lecture notes after the lecture. You don't need to memorize this slide at all. You just need to understand the important part of it, which I'm going to get into now. Okay? So a tariff is going to help import competing industries. For instance, producers are going to now sell at a higher price thanks to this tariff. So which is good for them, which is good for domestic producers. Imagine, for instance, Canadian farmers would be happy if there is a tariff on foreign milk. I will get into the deadweight loss in a minute. It harms consumers because the demand is downward sloping. And the government, finally, is earning a revenue equal to the tariff times import levels. So, how does it look on the graph when I say it harms consumers? I hope all of you are familiar with the notion of consumer surplus, but in rough terms, consumer surplus is the same as utility function, utility. So the utility is the amount of happiness consumers derive from the consumption of a good. If the price is PW, imagine here first it's PW, and consumers have this demand function. The demand function, remember, is the price at which they are willing to pay for the good. If this unit, they are willing to pay this much, but they actually pay PW, the difference between those two quantities represents extra happiness for the consumer. It's like the feeling of having done a deal. I was willing to pay $500 for my PlayStation 5 and I paid $400. Nice. I have money left in my pocket. I'm pretty happy. If you add up all of those differences up until the quantity consumed, you get a gigantic blue triangle here. Note that the one on the graph is smaller due to the tariff. If the price is now higher because of the tariff, consumers will purchase less. You can see here, that's the new quantity they will purchase. And the difference between how much they're willing to pay and how much they actually pay is lower. So their blue triangle is now smaller compared to before. Okay? So consumers are harmed. They wish there was no tariff. They wish they could import without having to pay a tariff because they don't care. At the end of the day, they just want to get the good, whether it's made by a local producer or a foreign one. Producers, on the other hand, is going to go the other way around. The supply curve represents the price at which they are willing to sell the good. So if they sell the good at PW, the difference between PW and what's on the supply curve is pretty much their profit. This is extra money. So adding this over all the quantities purchased, and you get to this small red triangle if there is no import subsidy, if there is no, import tariff. Now, with a tariff, the price will increase. The producer is now willing to sell a higher quantity than before. This dot here is higher than QH. Since the consumer demand is still higher, producers will sell everything they have at a higher price. So their producer surplus, which is the same as profit, will be higher than before. Finally, the government is also earning some money here because the government is imposing a tax on the imports. So for each unit sold, the government is going to receive $T. The government will end up taxing that many imports because those are the new imports at a tariff equal to T, which is the distance between those two numbers. So the yellow rectangle represents the government revenue. So you can call this a government surplus as well. It turns out that, as mentioned in the chat, area A and area C used to be surplus. They used to be consumer surplus. Now they are no surplus at all. Nobody gets those things. It's neither red, nor blue, nor yellow, but it used to be blue. So this area, A plus C, is what we call the deadweight loss. It is the loss in surplus as a whole from society's point of view due to a tariff. Although it makes producers better off and the government gets revenue out of it, it makes consumers so much worse off that overall the situation is worse than it was without a tariff. That's what you need to remember. I won't show you this graph in the exam, but you need to know that in the case where you have a country like this, which is a small country, I will get into that, a tariff will always imply a deadweight loss, a loss of surplus. If you want to know more about this, you can talk to me in office hours, but I don't expect you to know too much about this. That would take a whole other hour to explain the mechanics behind this graph. So we talked about tariffs from an economic point of view, but there is also a political aspect to it. Tariff corresponds to a response to a demand for protection. Firms want to be protected from foreign exporters, and so they want a tariff to protect their domestic business. The demand for protection could be the marginal benefit to special interests. So instead of talking about demand for good, you could think about demand for protection. Same. The supply of protection is the government's willingness to harm consumers for the sake of the firm. And that could also be for political gains. A firm could lobby in favor of the government if the government promises to increase tariffs on imported goods. So it could be votes, lobbies push, lobbies in particular. Lobbies in the US have a huge impact on tariff schedules on some products. But it could be campaign contributions and so on. So the level of a tariff depends upon the relative political strength of special interest groups. If a particular industry is very strong at lobbying, very good at lobbying the government, chances are tariffs in that industry will be high and export subsidies will be high as well. So there will be imports on goods that come from abroad, and they will benefit from a subsidy if they want to sell their good abroad. If that particular industry is not very strong, then the government will probably prefer low tariffs in order not to harm consumers too much. Let's go over an interesting concept. And when I say interesting, I mean also very useful and a concept you will see a lot in econ courses. Have any of you heard about game theory? This is what we're going to get into right now. Why is liberalization mostly bilateral, so it goes both ways, rather than, or multilateral, rather than unilateral? Yes, John Nash, absolutely. John Nash, who died in 2015, in May 2015. Car accident. Anyway, so here is a game theory model that is supposed to represent trade relationships between Canada and the US. So let me walk you through this table. Canada has two options. It can be protectionist, so tariffs, or it can promote free trade, no tariffs. US can do exactly the same thing, protectionism or free trade. Each country has to choose one option. The numbers in the table represents what we call the payoffs or the rewards or the utility associated to each outcome. If both Canada and the US are being protectionist, they both will have a utility or a profit, if you like, of -5. The idea is that they both impose high tariffs on each other, so they won't benefit a lot from trade. Now imagine that Canada is promoting free trade, so they say no tariffs. US can export their stuff to Canada, but no tariff. But US decides to be protectionist. So if Canada wants to export to the US, then there is a tariff. Well, the US is going to benefit a lot from trade with Canada because they can export for free. Very nice. They're going to export a lot. And when they import, since they impose a tariff, the domestic industries will be favored. So their payoff will be a big fat 20 between being able to export easily and limiting imports thanks to a tariff. But this will come at the cost for Canada. Canada will have a hard time exporting because of a tariff imposed by the US, and in terms of imports, it won't change much. It will import as much as before because the US is still actively exporting, which will harm its own industry. So the payoff will not be -5, but now will be -10. Now, for the sake of this example, I made the same payoffs for the opposite case. If the US instead goes for free trade, but Canada goes for protectionism, US gets -10 and Canada gets 20. Finally, if they both freely trade with each other, they both make a positive profit, a net gain of 10, because they benefit each from low tariffs and low export subsidies. So they gain from trade in the conventional sense. This particular game is called a prisoner's dilemma. You can imagine that Canada and the US are actually two prisoners which are being interrogated at the same time separately. They have two options. They can either confess that they did the thing, and they can turn their accomplice in, or they can deny any fact and say, I don't know what you're talking about. Both can do it. And the payoffs will be exactly the same. Protectionism will be the case where they confess. They both say, yes, I did this and he was there with me. That's his fault. The other one would say the same thing about you. So at the end of the day, both people would take a big -5 of payoff, which can be represented by 5 years of prison, if you want. If one of them confesses and says, yeah, he did it, but the other one says, I don't know what you're talking about, the one who confesses will get away with a nice sentence, maybe just 1 year of prison, or maybe just being freed. But the one who denied, but got turned into by his accomplice, will go for a big sentence, 10 years. The other way around as well. But if both are denying, they don't confess, they say, I don't know what you're talking about, you have no proof, then maybe they will be released and have a positive payoff. Now, imagine that Canada chooses free trade. So now Canada is here. US can be protectionist, in which case it will make a payoff of 20, or it can do free trade and get a payoff of 10. So if Canada goes for free trade, US wants to do protectionism. And when Canada chooses protectionism, so imagine now we are in this column, US can do protectionism and get -5, or do free trade and get -10. So it will also prefer to do protectionism. So in this case, we say that protectionism is a dominant strategy. The US wants to do protectionism no matter what, which is why I underline those two payoffs. Those two payoffs correspond to the US doing protectionism. But it is the same for Canada. Canada also wants to do protectionism. You can do the same reasoning the other way around, and every time Canada wants to adopt protectionist measures. The problem with that is that they both strictly prefer to be protectionist, and by being protectionist, they will end up with a payoff of -5 each, which is not great. The general surplus is pretty low. One sale they would like to be at is this one, free trade, 10-10. The problem is, if one of them unilaterally decides to do free trade, the other one wants to screw it over and do protectionism. And you would end up either here or here. So if you let the US and Canada decide on their own, they are going to go for protectionist measures. And they're going to be stuck in this bad situation, in this bad equilibrium. How to break this dilemma, how to go from this shitty sale to this better sale? Cooperate or be under an organization that is going to make you sign binding agreements. So NAFTA, EU, GATT, all of those organizations will make you sign binding agreements. If you break the agreement, the other country can retaliate as well. In this, if both countries bilaterally agree to free trade, countries will end up in this case, which is generally is the best case for everybody. In terms of general surplus, if you add those numbers together, you get a number of 10, which is bigger than this -10 for sure, which is bigger than this, which is equal to 10, and this, which is equal to 10. So a binding agreement is what you need if you want to get out of this prisoner's dilemma. You can check the movie called A Beautiful Mind, which talks about the life of John Nash and how he came up with this idea. This is the first game he came up with, and since then, many different games that model different situations have been created, and where the outcome is different. Yeah, the movie is very great. It's very good. So countries making decisions unilaterally leads to the least desirable outcome here. Note that this is just a model. It's just a way to represent different situations. You could make this game more complicated by adding more actions. Instead of just protectionism and free trade, you could have low tariff, high tariff, export subsidy, non-tariff barrier, and so on. And you can make the game more complex. This is a simple modelization of trade between two countries. I'm going to try to get quick. I'll try to get it done in 5 minutes. I think it's almost the end. Why does liberalization encourage further liberalization? Reciprocal trade talks realign political economy forces inside each participating nations. The idea is that if that governments find it optimal to remove tariffs they thought were optimal before, because the multilateral negotiations now make it beneficial to everybody at the same time, and in particular exporters. If another country commits to lower its tariff or delete or suppress its tariffs, then it's good for your exporters. So that gives you an incentive to also lower your tariffs to make the agreement happen. Multilateral negotiation makes exporters into anti-protectionists. So politically speaking, it's also a way political parties can get an edge. The export sector strengthens with each tariff cut. The lower the tariffs, the better it is for exports. They can also gain in political influence, so they can maybe grow their industry, lobby more, contribute to campaigns, and so on. And so by doing this, they can lobby even further for more and more tariff cuts. Moreover, the bigger the trade bloc, so if there is a bloc, an RTA which is big and covers many countries, non-members have stronger incentives to also join that organization, that RTA, to benefit from either the common tariff schedule or any sort of agreement. And that will foster trade creation. So there is this network effect, kind of like YouTube. The more users there are on YouTube, the more interesting it is for non-YouTube users to use YouTube. Same for Twitter. Typically, online platforms have huge network effects. If you have 10 different platforms for information, you don't know which one to go to. If there is one, or at least if in one of them the number of users increases, then you have more incentives to go to that platform because you're going to get more content. But by you going to that platform, you increase the number of users, which gives more incentives to other people to join the platform as well. And this is how you end up with YouTube being as big as it is. Vimeo used to be a competitor for YouTube, but now it's very, very small. Dailymotion, French website, used to be big. It used to be as big as YouTube back when YouTube was created. But I don't know, they missed something at some point, and now they are really small. Now Dailymotion gathers videos that are being deleted by YouTube for whatever reasons, pretty much. So this is pretty much a summary of tariff politics. Depending on the political strength of pro and anti-tariff interest groups, this will push governments against or for tariff liberalization, which will lead to multilateral negotiations, and this will feed back into making interest groups, whether they're pro or anti-tariff, bigger. But this is another virtuous circle. As long as you can push for lower tariffs, multilateral negotiations will definitely have a positive feedback on the anti-tariff industries that can then push for even more tariff cuts to the government, which will push for even more multilateral negotiations. Of course, it takes decades, because if you want to strengthen the interest group, which is anti-tariff, in an economy where industries are mostly pro-tariff, you need time. You need to lower tariffs little by little, and little by little, you're going to gain influence, and you will be able to weigh heavier on the government's decisions, which in turn will translate into more and more multilateral negotiations. So there's this idea of a domino effect. Sorry, I'm going to take a minute or two. It's pretty much the end. Pro-membership forces want to prevent trade diversion, right? And they want to foster trade creation. If the export sector is politically larger than the import competing sector, non-member countries will start joining those RTAs to increase the export sector even further. Where am I? Okay. I'm gonna stop here. They are only, well, yes. I'm gonna stop here because I don't have any time anymore. But you should take a look at the last lecture notes, the last slides. They are fairly straightforward. So you might need to, you'll definitely might need to know what the summary of the first unbundling is for next week's quiz. So, if you look at the world GDP share, remember the graph from before, they used to mostly be associated to the A7 countries, which finally are shown. And after 1820, they increased for the G7 countries and decreased for the A7 countries due to industrialization of the north and deindustrialization of the south. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I'm sorry I took some overtime. Have a good rest of your week. Next week there's going to be a quiz, so make sure you know your content, and have a good one. Bye.